the Confederate submarine, and this is about the watch that was that belonged to the captain of the ship. The Hunley was a Southern-built hand-cranked submarine, 8-man crew, and sunk a northern ship. It would, it says, would this be a breakthrough? The South needed to destroy northern naval ships and the blockade that was crippling southern shipping. But then the Hunley vanished, not to be seen atop the water until she was raised in Charleston Harbor in August of 2000. The mystery of her sinking is a fabulous and complex one, and is still being investigated. Many questions required answers, and many experts in various disciplines would need to come up with answers following a myriad of clues. We need only concern ourselves at this point with one clue: the captain's pocket watch. And speaker Daniel Nye, he's an internationally recognized authority on the manufacture, conservation, and restoration of clock and watches. Taught and lectured extensively, has provided horological consulting services to the government and to many national watch and clock making organizations. And he runs the school. He's the owner and director of York Time Institute, a school of watch and clock making, which was licensed in 2008. And he's previously served as director of the School of Horology of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. And his education requires students to master a wide variety of skills and techniques through active participation. So a lot of hands-on work if you're going to study with him. But tonight we're going to look at Abraham Lincoln, my favorite subject. But tonight we welcome David Kent, fellow Lincoln historian. He was a former scientist. He's the current president of the Lincoln Group of DC. He's on the executive committee and board of directors of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, board of advisors for the Lincoln Forum. And tonight's talk is based on his recent book, Lincoln, the Fire of Genius. And he's going to be talking tonight about Lincoln and the use of technology in the Civil War. So let's welcome David Kent.
So thanks for coming out tonight, and thanks to the millions of people who are on Zoom, I think. I'm going to try not to move too much tonight, which is hard for me not to walk around, so I can stay in the Zoom screen. But so as Scott said, I'm going to talk about how Lincoln influenced science and technology in the Civil War. But the first question you have to ask when you deal with that question is, why Lincoln? What did he know about science and technology? What did he do? Who cares about what Lincoln thought about science and technology in the Civil War before? So I'm going to start a little bit before the Civil War, pretty much when Lincoln's a little kid. But I'll actually start, if I can make this work. Lincoln in 1859, around then, gave a lecture called Lecture on Discoveries and Inventions. And he gave it half a dozen times or so in the Illinois area. Now, it was not the Gettysburg Address as far as Lincoln's type of speeches are, but it was something that was interesting and important, and it was about science. Specifically, he talked about the development of man. And he started with a lot of biblical references, and starting with Adam and Eve. He said, Adam and Eve, they had the fall, and they realized they were naked, so they decided that they needed to invent the fig leaf apron. And this led to clothing. Now, there's a few steps in between that, but basically, before you get to this, you start off with the idea of this fig leaf apron, and then people start to realize that they need to clothe themselves, if nothing else, to keep from freezing. So they can wear like a bear skin. They killed a bear and they can wear a bear skin. Then they realized that, well, we could take fibers from some animals like sheep, make wool, or from plants like cotton and make fibers and make clothing. Well, to make a long story short, you have to invent a lot of things to go from, a wool or cotton to clothing. And that involved a lot of invention, a lot of innovation, everything from needles to spinning wheels to the idea of looms. Eventually, you get sewing machines, you get to the idea of steam engines, and you get to railroads, which have nothing to do with clothing. But he, kept going and through advances. This lecture talked about technological advances in using the idea of communication. So it starts off, again, very rudimentary. We're talking the idea of pointing and grunting and saying, to communicate the idea that there's a saber-toothed tiger coming. And then it was language where you could tell somebody there's a saber-toothed tiger coming. Well, that's only good for the person in front of you, especially if they can only speak your language, which at that time they probably was only one. So eventually you get to the idea of writing. Because now you can write it down and leave it for somebody else and like give instructions for how to get in, how to avoid being eaten by saber-toothed tigers or whatever. Eventually you get to the idea of printing presses. Printing presses was the great democratizer. In picture before printing press, the Bible was really the first thing that was printed. Before that, picture the monks, one letter at a time in Latin. Nobody else can read this. It would take years to copy over one copy of the Bible. Not so great for getting word out. Printing presses were able to now get this word out to a lot of people. And of course, everybody had a Bible, even at this time, in Lincoln's time, everybody had a Bible. It wasn't a Gideon's Bible, but everybody had a Bible. Then you get to the idea of what's some of the more critical type of discussions that go on in the 1850s, including printing the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. It sold like 300,000 copies in the first few months after it was published, really changed the dynamic of the idea of slavery. More important about the printing press was the idea of newspapers. Now you could get cheaply print these newspapers in the common language, and it really increased the idea that people could learn, people could find out information about different things. And they could all do this very cheaply. It wasn't anymore just these elite people that have money that can afford books at that point. So he goes from this to telegraph in this lecture, and if he were around today, he would be talking about Twitter or going viral on TikTok or some other thing I don't know about. So this lecture, really the idea behind this lecture was that man can better his condition through innovation, through intelligence, through invention. And by extension, governments can help facilitate that, which I'll get into in a minute. Now, one more thing I want to mention about this lecture is at the very, very, very end of this, he talks about the patent laws. He said, before the patent laws, you invented something, your neighbor could steal the idea and sell it to whoever else he could con into believing he invented it, and you didn't have any recourse, that was it. But after the patent laws, the inventor had for at least this limited time, like 15 years, he had time to be able to market it, to commercialize it. So this exclusive use period added a fuel of interest to the fire of genius in the discovery and production of new and useful things. Now, of course, I use fire of genius for the title of my book. That's the innovation, the inventiveness, the inquisitiveness, the invention of new ideas. But just as important to Lincoln was his fuel of interest. This is the fuel of financial interest, mainly, afforded by the patent system. Because now, when you invent something, nobody can legally, at least, take your idea and do anything with it. You have time to commercialize your idea and make money with it. So even the simplest, poorest people can come up with an idea and market it and become rich. They can add to the world, they can better their own condition. So this is a theme that really runs through Lincoln's whole life. People having the ability to better their condition. It's no longer about being on the East Coast, where you had access to, some people, I should say, had access to education and money and leisure time to be able to learn these new things and study classics. Lincoln grew up on a farm, so he didn't have access to any of that. And he understood that people like him would do better as well. And that becomes important to him through his life. So what did he know? You know, he grew up on a farm, right? On the frontier, where there wasn't much. So this is a John Deere steel plow, which didn't get invented until after Lincoln was off the farm. But Lincoln, during the course of his life, and especially as a lawyer and was on the circuit, you know, would go out and see these new inventions on the farm. And plows was one of those things that you saw a lot of new technology coming in. You know, Lincoln as a little kid in Kentucky, he is dragging a stick through the soil and dropping seeds in it. His father has a wooden mortarboard. It's like the plow part of the plow with the mortarboard. You know, he's a wooden mortarboard, and early on, he's probably even got strapped over it and dragging it behind himself, but probably by the time Lincoln's around, his father is using horses or oxen to drag this wooden mortarboard. Then there's cast iron. Okay, much better job at plowing the field. And then because cast iron is a little fragile, it could break if you hit rocks, there were replaceable parts for it. And eventually to something like this, a steel plow. And beyond this, steam engines, which I'll talk about a little bit. While this was going on, there was a lot of this kind of innovation going on in the first half of the 1800s. We had the plow aspects that I talked about, but there's things called reapers to collect, harvest the crops. There's seeders to help plant the crops. There are all this innovations happening on the farm, and Lincoln is absorbing all of this information. But he's on the frontier. And when he moves from Kentucky, the family moves from Kentucky to Indiana, he moves into an area that he says is of unbroken forest. And when you look around in this area around New York, you'll see that there's a lot of rolling hills, a lot of farms, a lot of townhouse farms these days, a lot of farms, some forest still, it's not secondary forest. But primary forests, these unbroken forests in Indiana and all these areas covered everything. And you can't grow crops in a forest, which is why there's no trees anymore. So he had to learn forest ecology. So here I just have a picture that shows different kinds of roots for different kinds of trees. That affects how easy it is to get these trees out of the way. He also had to learn about there's hardwoods, there's softwoods, there's trees that are kind of really dry and tight, and there's trees that are wet and sappy, you know, pine trees. There are trees that are very tall and straight, and there are trees that are branch out right from the bottom. All of that comes into play when you figure out how to get rid of the trees and what to use the trees for, including like if you want to build a log cabin, obviously you can't use a tree that's all branches. You have to use something that's straight. So he has to learn some civil engineering as well. All the time while he's out on the farm and his father is telling him through his family history, it comes down to him. You have to learn how to agronomy, science of growing crops. You can't just once you clear the ground, throw seeds in it and come back in 6 months and harvest the crops. There's a lot more to it, including soil nutrition, soil conditions, hydrology. All of this kind of sciencey stuff is something that you learn about as a farmer that you don't even think about as science, because it's just something that gets passed down through family history. Now, he did have some formal education, not much. He says when he runs for president that he had a total of 1 year of formal education, total, in his whole 21 years of his early life. He went to school here and there, he did a couple of weeks here, a couple of weeks there, and he would skip 2 years, and then he would do a couple more years or weeks or maybe a month, or totally a year. He says, all I learned was reading, writing, and ciphering to the rule of 3, which doesn't sound like much, you know, ciphering to the rule of 3, ciphering is math. The rule of 3 is a simple ratio. Except when you look at pages from his sum book, this is one fragment from one page of a sum book that he had kept. It's originally about 100 pages. But by the time that Herndon got this from his stepmother after the assassination, there were only about 12 pages left. But when you look at these 12 pages, you can see he learned a lot more than he lets on. There are the obvious things like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, but there's long multiplication, long divisions of very complex numbers. And I noticed one of the things I saw was like you have, and I remember doing this as a kid, some of you probably do too. Long division, you get the answer, and then you have to proof it by back calculating everything back to the original numbers, which nobody these days does. So it's a lot more complicated. And he says, I studied also Pike from front to back, Pike's arithmetic. Well, Pike's arithmetic, go through the whole thing, which I did. There's a lot more to it. For example, something like the rule of three. Well, there's a single rule of three, but there's also a double rule of three and inverse rule of three. There's also something called reductions, there's fractions, there's decimals. There's calculating interest rates, calculating discount rates. There's a lot of actual math in there. And then on top of all of this, they can study it on his own. So he was one, he would borrow books from everything. So he would read this and study on his own. Of course, he taught himself law later on, and he taught himself Euclid geometry, which I'll talk about in a minute. So he's learning a lot more through self-study. Then he has, I keep pushing that laser, but then he had some jobs. He's in New Salem, and he had basically 3 jobs. He's he does some odd jobs, but then he's a clerk, and he actually owns a store in New Salem. So all of this stuff about the rule of 3 comes in because it's like, well, if it's $10 for a bushel of corn, how much is it for 1.5 bushels of corn? So you have to use the rule of 3 in order to figure that out. But there's also a lot of other problems. You might have seen on that last piece, the word shilling. There are British measures and there are American measures. So weights and measures and currency. So we had to figure out, calculate all of these different things. So there's a lot more, a little bit more to it than he expected. He also was a postmaster. There was no such thing as stamps. So the recipient paid the bill for the postage. And the postmaster had to figure out what the postage was based on the number of pages and the distance that it traveled. He had to calculate all of that. Then he had to figure out, that somebody said, well, I have 1 shilling and I have 1, local American currency. He had to figure out all this stuff. And occasionally somebody would give him a peck of potatoes instead of the payment for the thing. So he had to figure out what's what. But he really learns more when he gets into being a deputy surveyor. You can see in this picture, there's the compass is on a long stick and it's chain. And this compass and chain is used to measure out and survey land. And he did a lot of land surveying. But there's a lot more to it than just dragging it out. You have to learn math. So he studies, he studies 2 books, Gibson and Flint. And when you read through those books about surveying, you'll see that he was also learning a lot of things in there, but he was learning things like geometry, which is the science of shapes, and trigonometry, it's the science of angles. If you remember things like sine and cosine and tangents and cotangents and inverses of all of those, he had to learn all of that in order to be able to do this job properly. Then you go out in the field and nothing is like flat. You've got rivers, you've got rocks, you've got trees, you've got all sorts of things in the way. So he learned a lot of math this way. He also, in his spare time, studying on his own, besides teaching himself the law, he also studied astronomy. So he actually knew quite a bit of astronomy. And he knew some basic physics. So when we get to and one of the other things he did was he took 2 flatboat trips to New Orleans. The first was from when he was still in Indiana and went down the Ohio River, which is a pretty big river, to the Mississippi and down to New Orleans. Second time he was in Illinois And he goes down the Sangamon River. If you've ever been out in Illinois and go to New Salem, you can see the Sangamon now, which is much smaller than it was at Lincoln's time. But even then, it was hard to move around in it. And he gets this thing stuck on the mill dam, which I'll come back to in a minute. But you can see where the forest ecology kind of comes in the way, because building a flatboat isn't as simple as just nailing some things together, maybe like nails. You know, you have to know which wood to use and how to put it together so it doesn't sink, you know, when you have all your animals on it. There's a little bit of physics. You can see they have these long oars. This is how they steered it. I won't go into it more because I go into it a lot in the book, but and anybody who's read Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi knows that floating a flatboat down the Mississippi River is not as simple as it might seem. There's a lot of issues you have to deal with, including the hydrology of the river, a lot of low spots that you have to get around. And if something breaks in the levee, you could end up in some farmer's field, which is not really conducive to floating a flatboat. But he learned a lot on the river, on some physics and some of this all the way down. But on the way back, 'cause you can't float a flatboat back up, on the way back, he takes a steamship. Now, Lincoln didn't have a lot of money, even after selling all this stuff for his father. So he has to work. And on the steamship, mainly they put him ashore with other guys with an axe, and they cut cordwood to throw into the boilers. So he brings us all on there, and he's there with the engineer, and they're throwing this into the furnace to burn the wood, to heat the water, to create steam. And the steam moves these pistons that turn the wheels, side wheels or stern wheels on a ship. So he's learning all of this mechanical stuff, even this early on the ship. He's also spent a lot of time up in the pilot house, learning how to pilot steamboats. And he becomes a kind of a part-time steamboat pilot on the Sangamon River when he's later on, when he's living up in New Salem. Now, the last thing I'll mention before I show you the picture, the last thing I'll mention is, I remember he said he got stuck on the mill dam in New Salem on his way down the second time in the flatboat. He took control and he figured out how to get it around there, and he learned some things about getting boats stuck. Later, when he's coming back from Congress, many years later, he's coming through the Great Lakes and he's on a steamship, and he sees another steamship that is stuck on a shoal. And he sees the captain is getting the crew overboard, and they're throwing little barrels or trying to get little empty barrels underneath the boat, putting wood, whatever they can get under there to try to give it float it a little bit more to get it off this shoal. So he sees this in his own experience, and he invents a method for getting boats over shoals. And he gets a patent for this thing. And he still today is the only president with a patent. And this thing, I won't go into it, I talk about it in the book, but you can see these two little bladder-like things here. They could be inflated with air from either steam, if it's a steamship, or just hand pumping. This takes into consideration a scientific principle called the Archimedes principle, which is buoyancy and displacement in ships. And he's learned enough about this to be able to figure out how to do this. And he writes out the design and draws as much as he can, and then he gets some help to build this model, brings it back to Washington, and he gets a patent. So today he's still the only one with a patent. So he's learning and he's applying a lot of this information. Now, as an adult, he has two main jobs. He is a lawyer and he's a politician. He was a politician before he was a lawyer. So as a politician, at 25 years old, he gets elected to the Illinois State Legislature. He serves 4 terms, 2 years apiece, so 8 years as an Illinois State legislator, and he becomes the Whig leader. And he, like all Whigs, believe in the idea of internal improvements. So this was like, the Whigs were a progressive type of, using today's terminology, they were like a progressive party. And they believed in internal improvements and government influence on those to help facilitate those things. So internal improvements, today we would call it infrastructure projects. So that we're building roads. Lincoln had a lot of experience trying to ride horses and wagons through mud that were supposed to be roads. We're building roads, making rivers more navigable, like the Sangamon River, which tried to make it more navigable, get steamships further up to increase commerce for the area. Building canals, to come back to the second, and railroads. Lincoln did a lot of work later on in his law career with railroads. So there were some financial problems with this. There was some that weren't caused by Illinois, they were caused by Wall Street, basically. And they came all across all the states that were doing this had problems. So they cut back on a lot of it, but Lincoln made sure that the Illinois and Michigan Canal got built. Lincoln wanted to be, and he told his friend Joshua Speed this in a letter, I would like to be remembered as the DeWitt Clinton of Illinois. Now, we're in Pennsylvania, so has anybody heard of DeWitt Clinton? I see people nodding. So DeWitt Clinton was the governor of New York State when the Erie Canal went into service. And he had been instrumental prior to being governor of getting the Erie Canal built. So the Erie Canal goes from the Hudson River above Albany across state to Lake Erie. And it did huge things for the economy of New York State. It really helped New York State become a major player in commerce. You're getting a lot of things now going by land from New England across New York State, and even some going down through New York City and Hudson River up and across. So Lincoln saw this Illinois-Michigan Canal as completing the circuit. It goes from Lake Michigan in Chicago down to LaSalle, where it meets the Illinois River. So in this upper map, if I can get it, oh, too far. This is the canal, this is the Illinois River, and then all of this all the way down to New Orleans is the Mississippi. So this would complete that circuit, and it would do for Illinois what the Erie Canal did for New York. It did get built, it did get put into operation, and it did do what Lincoln had hoped to do. It really, really helped the economy of Illinois. And it's probably the main reason why Chicago went from a little village to a big city in like 10 years. And it's just a huge growth in Chicago. So that was one of the programs that he pushed through. He pushed through a lot of these different things. Now, he also was a lawyer. And as a lawyer, he started off doing the usual stuff that most lawyers do when they're first, they're very small things. But as he became known for being interested in technology, he started doing more and more patent and technology cases. There were everything from medical devices and medical malpractice type cases to things like this. Now, this is an early version of a Reaper machine. You can see that very, very rudimentary chain and cog type of system to make it move and turn those bars. And this would harvest, in this case, wheat. And it really improved the ease at which you could harvest your crops. So it allowed farmers to plant more acres and make more money. And now it was less about subsistence, getting enough to feed yourself and your family. Now it was going more and more and more towards a cash economy where you could sell this stuff. And then you would have extra cash and you could buy things that you couldn't grow. More horses or, eventually cars. So he gets involved in a lot of cases. One of them involves a Reaper I won't go into here. I talk about in the book is this Manny McCormick Reaper case, which is a very, very famous case where McCormick accused Manny of stealing his patent idea for a Reaper device, which was a little bit more complicated than this. Lincoln goes and he gets the two side by side, he takes them apart, he sees how they work, sees how they're different, how they're the same. He gets an engineer come in and help work with him on different parts of this thing. And he's all set to try the case, which then moves out of Chicago into Cincinnati. They bring a local lawyer in by the name of Edmund Stanton, Edwin Stanton doesn't want to have anything to do with Lincoln, and he tries the case, and Lincoln just sort of sits there and it's like, I could have told you this, I knew all this stuff. But he did all this, a lot of other things. One of the other issues that he dealt with that was technology related is the Effie Afton case. The Effie Afton is a steamship. And the shortened version of the story, steamship leaves St. Louis, goes upriver on the Mississippi River, gets to Rock Island, which is an island between Illinois and Davenport, Iowa. It's a narrower place in the river. Steamboat gets up there, immediately crashes into the very first railroad bridge built across the Mississippi River. Like 2 weeks after this bridge is in service. Steamship catches fire, burns to the ground, destroys $2 million worth of property. Nobody was hurt, miraculously. But it damages the bridge. They can't run any trains over it now. And the steamship company sues the bridge manufacturer and the railroads and says, you can't build these bridges. There are obstructions. We're going to keep hitting them and it's just, you can't do that. It's obstructions. They sues them. Now Lincoln, again, shows how much he understands and how important he thinks all of this is. He goes out there and he knows how to run a steamship because he's been doing it off and on the Sangamon River. He understands how fast it's going and how to steer it. He gets an engineer, helps him measure the speed of the river, the angle of the river, how it hits the bridge and the steamship, any eddies that might be created by the pylons that are holding up the bridge. All of this stuff, in his closing arguments in the case, convinces most of the jury that not only is the bridge not an obstruction, but probably the steamship, either through negligence or intent, caused this accident. Long story, much shorter, it's much more complex than this, is that they rebuild the bridge, they run trains over it, and it completely changes the economy of the United States. Up until this point, everything had to, if it was coming west by land, once it hit the Mississippi, you had to go down the Mississippi to New Orleans. If you wanted to get to California, you had to take everything off the Mississippi, in New Orleans, put it on a ship, bring it down as far as Central America. There was no Panama Canal, unfortunately, at that time. So they had to go mostly across Costa Rica, put it on another ship, go up to the West Coast. So now you could run trains over bridges, over even big rivers like the Mississippi, and really built this east-west transport and commerce. So it really changed both the commerce side of things, but also moving people, made it easier to do it. And Lincoln, again, later on, is instrumental in the Transcontinental Railroad. So I want to talk about Civil War because we've been talking for a while, and I want to talk about Civil War and Lincoln and the Civil War. So now you see that Lincoln actually knew quite a bit of science and technology. He wasn't a scientist by any stretch of the imagination, but he understood it enough, and he understood the importance of it, and he helped promote it. So he thought that this was incredibly important to the future of the United States and to help people better their condition. So we get to the Civil War, of course, everything gets thrown out because now we're at war. And Lincoln knows nothing about war. He was 3 months in the 3 months in the Black Hawk War, didn't see any actual fighting, doesn't really know any, that's all he had for military. He doesn't even know anything about administering a big country either, so he's kind of winging it. So he does what he always does. He goes and he borrows books. So the first book, one of the first books he borrows in the Library of Congress is Elements of Military Art and Science by a guy by the name of Henry Wager Halleck. Anybody heard of Henry Halleck? Mm-hmm. Few people, yeah. So Henry Halleck was a big guy during the Civil War. And he had written this kind of guidance manual for, how to do not just the science, not just how to do military strategy, but the art science of military strategy, which Lincoln learned. So he learns all of this stuff, But more importantly, people find out very quickly that he's really, really interested in stuff, in technology and in weaponry and in new things. So they line up at the door and either they're asking for a job or they're trying to sell him on their idea for a new weapon that is gonna end the war tomorrow. Trust me, it will end the war tomorrow. Just put this into service. Sure, I'll make a lot of money, but you know, this is for the war effort. So Lincoln was like, yeah, okay, come on in, we love this stuff. Now, most of the people in this group probably know that, you know, at the beginning of the war, everybody got rank and file, they were getting muskets, smoothbore muskets, and then quickly in the first year, they were getting rifle muskets. They're still muskets. And they're good, they work, they're simple, they're cheap, they can get them around. And Lincoln was like, these are nice, but can't we have something better? Because we have people coming in like this guy Spencer. And Spencer has this idea for this gun that you can have 7 bullet shells in a cartridge. And you can put this cartridge in the butt of the rifle. And you can use this cool little lever to get the next shell into the chamber. And you can fire 7 shots very quickly. I mean, you know, the people that might be reenactors, usually you're using muskets, you know that if you load a musket, usually you're standing up there and you're putting everything down the barrel and you're pumping it down. And if you're really, really good, you can get a couple shots off a minute, maybe 3. This, you can get 7 shots off pretty quick. And Lincoln's like, I love this. Went out and tested it on what's now the Ellipse in Washington. Pretty good shot, actually. And he tells the military, hey, this is great. And we got some other guys like this thing, you should use it. And the military, especially a guy by the name of James Worth Ripley, who's the ordnance officer, says, hey, yeah, this is really, no, we don't want this. It's too complicated. It's, you know, we have to have a supply chain for all these pieces. You know, a lot of moving parts that could break. You know, you got guys last week were plowing their back 40. You know, now they're out here being shot at. They're gonna take 7 shots really quickly, then they're gonna realize they have no ammunition. And they're gonna throw it in the mud. I know a lot of mud, because the Civil War was a very wet 4 years. They said, no, we don't want this. And Lincoln did understand this. You know, when he was dealing with the military, he did understand not everything because it's new and cool is going to be appropriate or going to be a good idea. So most of the time he suggested, he said, I think we should use this. It's up to you. Sometimes he was like, I think we should use this. It's up to you, but I really, really think you should use this. And other times he said, I like this, Spencer. You're gonna buy 50,000 of these things. You're gonna put them in service now. And we're gonna pay this guy a ton of money in order to get them into service. So he did order them to put some weapons to service. And this one did get used. There's variations of this. This is a carbine version, which is shorter. There's a longer version too. And there were a lot of other brands, Remington and other people who come up with similarities or variations. They did get used in some battles, and they were very important in some battles. Rank and file still had rifled muskets. But Lincoln was pushing the military, because the military, you know, the biggest complaint about the military is always that they're fighting by the tactics of the last war. And Lincoln was always like, he didn't have a lot of experience with the last war, so he didn't have anything to unlearn. He was always like, we should always be looking for something new. So it wasn't just small weaponry. He also was involved in larger weapons. Anybody know what this is called? It's actually called a Union repeating rifle. But Lincoln saw the top of this, which is a little hopper, you can throw some shells in and crank in the back, and you could fire a lot quicker through this single barrel. So he said, well, it looks like a coffee grinder to me, and he called it coffee mill gun. And that caught on, everybody started calling it a coffee mill gun. So this was something, again, one of those things that he said, buy them, put them in service, and they did. There were improvements over time, and all of these inventors, they were coming up to Lincoln and saying, we need this new weapon. So there was a Raphael repeating rifle, which was similar, but it had like a whole row of barrels that fire multiple barrels at a time. And then eventually you got to a Gatling gun, which was very complicated, very vicious. Very end of the Civil War, mostly after the Civil War, it was used out in Western fighting after. So he was pressing this sort of thing. He was also pressing things like a balloon core, which not everybody saw the need for. Ironically, George B. McClellan liked the idea of the balloon core, and probably one of the only things that he and Lincoln agreed on. So he was doing that as pushing weapon. But more importantly, he was dealing with other aspects of it. One of the things I really like this drawing, because this drawing shows both the USS Merrimack, which is this bottom part, and the CSS Virginia, which is this part. So obviously when Virginia left the Union, seceded from the Union, the US Navy had a naval yard at Gosport in down by Norfolk. And they said, well, okay, Virginia's leaving, we can't let them have all of the ships, we need to like scuttle all of them. So they tried to scuttle all these ships, burn them, or move them quickly, or burn them. They didn't do a very good job at any of them. So they ended up burning this down. This is the hull of a big wooden sailing ship that used to have a lot of cannons on it. Now it's just the hull, and the Confederacy raised this hull and put this iron cladding around the top, and only the iron cladding part would show above the water. So while they were building this, everybody in the North knew that they were building it because there were spies everywhere. There weren't a whole lot of secrets. They were publishing stuff in the newspapers about, oh yeah, they're building a nice ironclad down in Gosport Navy Yard. So everybody knew about it, and the North said, well, we're gonna need these. And they put an ad in the paper and they said, we need ironclads, anybody have a good design? And eventually, or very quickly actually, they came up with this design, which is the Monitor, or a Monitor. I don't know if it's the Monitor, but it's a Monitor class. So again, very, very long story, very short version of this is a guy by the name of Bushnell, goes up in New York City, talks to another guy named John Erickson, who he knew about this sort of thing, would ask him, what do you think about this design of ironclad that somebody gave me? And Erickson, when he gets there, he sees on Erickson's shelf as a model of the Monitor. He goes, you've already got this. And he goes, oh yeah, I came up with that a couple of years ago. I built this model. I tried selling it to Napoleon III, for their use. They weren't interested. They said they had their own. So it's just there. And Bushnell's like, you got to get this down, and you got to tell the ironclad board of the Navy. And Erickson says, Navy? I don't think so. I don't like the Navy. Erickson had an incident years before on the USS Princeton, which again, very short version of the story, a cannon exploded. They were testing these, showing off these cannons for the brass, for the high ups, including the Vice President of the United States and some cabinet members. And this cannon explodes, almost kills the Vice President. It does kill 2 cabinet members. And they blamed Erickson for it. Even though Erickson had nothing to do with that cannon, he had designed other cannon that didn't blow up. And he kept telling him the cannon that did blow up wasn't safe. And they blamed him anyway. So I'm not going down there. These guys blame me. Bushnell uses some subterfuge. He finagles this thing to a certain point where he ends up getting everybody together. Lincoln, the ironclad board, Erickson, Lincoln looks at the Monitor model. It looks at the designs, and he asks some pertinent questions. And he tells this joke. It ends with the punchline, says, I think there's something in it. And he pressures the ironclad board to make this thing happen. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, it took a while, but it did get done. And then Lincoln spends a lot of time circumventing the usual red tape. and writing orders to say, do this, do that, in order to get the parts, in order to build this quickly. And they did build it very, very quickly, and they got it down the Hampton Roads just in time. Maybe they could have gotten it down there a day earlier, would have been better. But they get down there to meet up with the CSS Virginia, which has destroyed two big wooden ships, wooden sailing ships, and was going for the third one. The Monitor shows up, they have a battle, fight to a draw, both of them a little bit bent, and they go back into their corners to fight another day. While this was happening, the captain of the Monitor gets injured, Captain Wortham, and he's up in Washington, and Lincoln visits him, and he's temporarily blinded. Talks to him, finds out that there are some issues with the Monitor, and between two of them, they talk about it, and a lot of these changes get made. And the Monitor gets put down, back in use, and sent back down to Hampton Roads. Well, 2 months later, Lincoln is in Hampton Roads. And Lincoln goes down there to see how things are going on. He's down at Fort Monroe. And he sees that, well, how come we haven't taken back the Navy Yard? Doesn't look like the Confederates, from what you're telling me, they're not really protecting it, but probably run tail if we try to attack it. And generals are like, well, I don't know, we have, and Lincoln says, do it. And he orders them to do it. He even takes a party ashore on the Confederate held territory to find a landing spot. They didn't end up using that landing spot, but they did use another one. And they took back the Navy Yard because Confederacy just said, well, we're not going to get into a fight here, and they ran. So while they're doing that, Lincoln's still on the ship. He's toured the Monitor, spoken to a lot of the crew, and he's there on the other ship, and he is saying, well, how come we're not firing at Confederate positions? And again, the admirals are like, well, or the captains are like, I don't know, I don't think it'll do much good. They go, fire on them. Oh, we gotta show them we're here. So they fire on them. They're firing all these things to Confederate positions. It's not doing much damage, but it's making a lot of noise. Virginia is sitting over inside the harbor, over by Craney Island at the entrance to James River, watching all of this in a spyglass. They don't know Lincoln is there, but they can see there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of noise. And the captain of Virginia decides, I'm not so much interested in getting involved in this. I think we should just run up the river. But they can't run up the river because the river's too shallow. So, well, let's just lighten the load a little bit and throw stuff overboard. They still can't get up the river because it's still too shallow. I said, well, okay, that's not gonna work, but now we're too light to make a run for it out the mouth. So we have to scuttle the ship. And they do, they get everybody off and they blow up their own ship, they blow up in Virginia. Now, the Monitor also never sees another service either. It drowns and trying to tow it down to North Carolina later. So Lincoln is not only instrumental in getting the Monitor built, he's instrumental in the destruction of the Virginia. So I go through all of this in the book, and I talk about the letters back and forth and reports, show how this happened. Monitors became very, very important. So it's good that Lincoln was pressing the issue on it. Not so much in the open water, but in the rivers. There are a lot of Monitors, both sides, and it made a big difference. Not Monitors, ironclads. Some Union had a lot of Monitors, a couple of different variations, and then some others. Most of the Virginia ones, I mean the Confederate ones, were more like Virginia. Okay, let me talk about a couple other things quickly because I've been talking for a while. Two big technological things that were important during the war, probably even more so than the weapons, were, this is the first, is the telegraph. Telegraph had only been invented in 1844. It's when they sent the first message. This is the first time it's used in warfare. Lincoln, first he's like, I think this is going to be a short war, don't need to worry about things. But when it became obvious it's a long war, and he realized that his generals aren't going to really act as fast and as aggressive as he'd like. He became more and more his own general-in-chief, as well as the commander-in-chief. And he was over in the War Office all the time, in the telegraph office, the War Department, sending, receiving, reading telegraphs. So for the first time, he could, like, you could send a message out close to the front and get messages close to the front. And then he's sending messages up. He's actually coordinating to some extent generals in different places and pressing them on different things. You know, eventually he gets Grant, he's doing all, he's controlling everything and he backs away. Before that, he's doing a lot of this himself. He actually gets Congress to give him the authority to effectively nationalize telegraph companies, put them under military control. Didn't really have to because they were willingly doing it because the government would be paying them a lot of money for sending these messages back and forth. So it became very, very important. Lincoln also knew that the telegraph was that the North had a huge advantage with this kind of thing, the telegraph, because they had a lot more telegraph lines already strung. They around the North than the South did. And they had a lot more resources, natural resources and manufacturing to be able to create all this new telegraph line that they had to run all over the place. And they put huge numbers of miles of telegraph line out. And you can see they were pretty nimble, they could move it out very quickly. The other big thing was railroads. Of course, I mentioned that Lincoln worked for the railroads, did a lot of work for the railroads in like 10 years on retainer with the Illinois Central Railroad, worked with a lot of different railroads. He understood how important they were, both for commerce, for the economy, and for moving people and supplies during the war. Again, and Congress gave permission to nationalize it, and again, the private companies were like, no problem, we'll just like do whatever you want us to do, just pay us per the mile, you know, where every time we move troops, just pay us. So they were making a killing. But the North, again, had much more, they had much more track already, they had much more ability to create new tracks and new railroad cars, engines. And they were using these things to move not only soldiers, heavy equipment like these mortars that you can't really pull behind a horse, building bridges to get to places, and supplies, food, clothing, shoes, which became very important. The North, by the end of the war, very, very well supplied. The South was running low on everything, starving, and the conditions are pretty bad. Okay. Let me talk about one thing. I've been talking for a long time. If you give me a few more minutes, I'll talk about one more thing that they can do. So this, people should recognize, is the Smithsonian Castle. And it was the only Smithsonian building at that time. It had only been in operation maybe 6 years or so before the beginning of the war. And it was very ivory tower type of science. This guy, Joseph Henry, was the first Secretary of Smithsonian and the only Secretary of Smithsonian at this point. He wanted this to remain neutral, in part because he says our job is to fund scientific research and write reports for scientific research to be read by a handful of scientists. That's our job. He also had been really, really good dinner buddies with Jefferson Davis before the war, who was a regent of the Smithsonian. So he didn't really like the idea of having a war in the first place, so he tried to keep it neutral. That said, they did have these high towers, so they did use them to test signal lights and other technological advances, a lot of signaling. But Lincoln relied on Joseph Henry. Henry became an informal science advisor to Lincoln. Lincoln would call on him in anything they do with science and technology. So one of the big things he called on him was to chair a 3-person permanent commission of the Navy. Now, I mentioned that, you know, Lincoln, from the beginning, had long lines of people showing up at his door carrying their new gun or plans for some new weapon or some new poison gas or with all sorts of weird stuff that some of these people came up with. And he listened to a lot of it. Well, he said, well, I'm not doing that, like the poison gas. He said no. But then he knew, I can't do all of this. I don't have the time. And I'm not an expert on this stuff. We need people who are experts. So he had Joseph Henry chair this permanent commission, and their job was to look at all of these new weapon designs and all their technological advances. And they threw out 90% of them. A lot of them were, crazy. But, there were some good ones, and they said, okay, let's test these and get them built, put them in the service, and other ones, they were like, you gotta show me more. It didn't mean Lincoln was out of the loop. He was not the hook here. People still, especially if the permanent commission turned them down, they would go running to Lincoln. And Lincoln learned very quickly that he needed to defer back to the board because it was too much hassle, but they would still come to you. So that was one of the things he did. And the permanent commission, technically it wasn't that permanent, it ended after the war. But essentially, it is permanent because there is a version of it that's still today. It was reincarnated for the Spanish-American War. In World War I, Thomas Edison, who I wrote a book about, was the head of I don't remember what it was called at the time, but the War Department's technology division will evaluate these new things. And of course, there's evaluations of these things in the Defense Department today. Another thing he decided that is important during the war was he signed into law the National Creation of National Academy of Sciences, which had 50 charter members, scientists from around the country, and they were there to work as volunteers whenever the government had some reason to ask them scientific or technology questions. One of the first things they had to deal with was compasses on ironclads. Every ship needs a compass, where they are and where they're going. And they work really, really well when you've got a big wooden ship with sails. Not so well when you take a compass and you surround it with ironclad. So they had to work on how do we figure that out. And they did a lot of other things during the war and afterwards. There's some question as to how much Lincoln had to do with the creation of this. Some people say, well, he just signed the bill, we didn't do anything. I showed that actually I found some information, I found some memos and stuff that showed he did have something to do with it. Plus Louis Agassiz, who was a scientist up at Harvard, very, very well known at the time, he had pushed this idea to President Buchanan, who said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with that because that's government. We don't want government to spend money on that. He went back to Lincoln because he knew Lincoln would be much more amenable to this. In any case, I showed that Lincoln did have a little bit at least to do with this, and maybe a little bit more than a little bit. But there's no question about Lincoln and the Department of Agriculture. Lincoln, in his December 1861 annual message to Congress, it's like what we call now the State of the Union, sent a message to the Congress, and amongst all the other things he talks about, he says, agriculture is the most important aspect of American culture. It's the most biggest employer, even in the North, which embraced industrialization and manufacturing. Still, the vast majority were still involved with agriculture. He says, and yet, we don't have any science in agriculture. He had given a lecture in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin State Agricultural Fair, back a year or so before he became president. And he, in a way, berated farmers, said, you can't just ad hoc things, you need to bring science to it. Remember, Lincoln was a farmer for the first 20 plus years of his life. He hated it. He couldn't wait to get away from it, but he knew how important it was. And he knew that it needed to be more than just farmers trying to figure it out. So he said, we need a Department of Agriculture. There's a dusty desk and maybe it was the Interior Department. The guy that used to sit there once in a while and did scientific research on his own time, died. We need a department. Congress, of course, by that time, it was all his own party, and they all said, sure, no problem, create a Department of Agriculture. Within a few months, Lincoln put in charge of it a guy by the name of Isaac Newton, his real name. And they started looking at doing research in seed production, seed varieties, soil nutrition, tillage practices, rotation of crops, all sorts of things. And then reporting this, not in a dusty scientific report that nobody would read, but back to scientists, back to farmers in the field. And they set up a system for getting this information out. This agricultural extension service and its variations still exist today. In fact, in my previous life as a scientist, I did a lot of work with the agricultural. And finally, I'll mention one more thing, and then I'll stop talking because I've been talking for a long time. You can sort of recognize this picture of Yosemite Valley. Middle of the war. Lincoln is visited by Senator John Conness from California. Lincoln has always been thought California was important. He always liked the idea of California, part because of the political reasons and the fact that it stretched the country, part because there were mineral resources like gold and silver, but also because it had a lot of open area and he just was fascinated by going to by that area. Now, he never made it out there, but he planned to go out there. In fact, his very last day of life, April 14th, April 6th, 1865. He talks with, he has a talk with somebody and says, yeah, I'm planning on going out to California after, we get settled after the war is over. He doesn't, obviously never gets there. But Conness talks him into this idea, and it wasn't a hard sell. And taking this federal land in California, giving it to the state of California on a stipulation that California protect this area, the Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of big trees. If you've never been out there, you need to go out there. And protect it forever in its natural state for the use and recreation of all men. And Congress passed a law so we can sign this, and he signs it. And they give this property, this huge area of Yosemite Valley and the redwood trees, sequoia trees, to the state, and they protect it. Now, obviously, years later, after the national park system was started, California gives Yosemite back to the federal government, and it becomes the third national park after Yellowstone and Sequoia. And then Yosemite. So to wrap this up, Lincoln, he knew a lot of science, he knew a lot of engineering. He was not a scientist. He was not a techie guy. I mean, he was not a technologist, but he knew enough about science technology to understand it in his real life. He knew how important they were. He knew how education, science, and technology could be used to help people better their condition. He knew that the federal government could play a role in facilitating that process to better their conditions, like the Transcontinental Railroad, like internal improvements, and like development of weaponry during the Civil War. He pressed these issues, he pressed and promoted these while he was a lawyer and as a legislator, both in Illinois and in his one term as a US Congressman. During the Civil War, he had a love-hate relationship with the military because, he understood that they can't just throw all this new stuff in there. At the same time, he saw the benefit of getting some of these new technologies. And then even during the war, he said, we need to institutionalize science technology in the federal government. We hadn't done any promotion, we hadn't had any real support of the science technology before the war, but this shows us how important it is. We need to now support it. So there was permanent commission, so now there's still that Office of Technology Development, whatever it's called today. National Academy is still around, Department of Agriculture is still around, the National Park System is still around. So all of this stuff was all based on this earlier part that I mentioned at the beginning. People can better their condition by being innovative, inventive, and the government can facilitate that process by putting in place these mechanisms, not just a patent system, but help do things that people can't do for themselves or companies can't do for themselves that benefit not only them, but the greater good of the country. At that, I will stop because I've been talking for an awfully long time. So I thank you all very much I appreciate you listening to me for so long. I have, I'll take whatever questions for hours long as you can stand me. And if you run out of questions, I actually have extra slides that I can talk about, like you want to hear about Mason Slidell and what that has to do with science. But anyway, I'll take whatever questions you have. Yes,
Do you think if Lincoln had not grown up on the frontier?
I'm sorry, I totally missed that. So could you,
Sure, okay. Do you think if Lincoln had not grown up on the frontier, you described in the early chapters of your book, his life, like in 1816, there was the year of no summer, and then his father, Thomas, was constantly moving them because of the farming conditions. There was the winter of the deep snow, and then you go from Kentucky. Did you hear me yet?
it is the chance to the last part.
Okay, could you describe in the early chapters of your book, his early life?
Yeah.
Lincoln's early life, and he had a really hard life.
Right.
I mean, he was doing so much physical labor. His father was constantly moving them from, they were in Kentucky where he was born, and then they went to Indiana. And then they had all this agricultural, like the summer that the volcano erupted in Indonesia, and they had the year of no summer. It was so cold, in the middle of something, the whole country was so this anomaly of weather problems. And he moves them to Indiana, and then there was the snow, the deep snow that one winter where he gets sent to get food for his family, and he gets frostbite on his feet. Okay, so he realizes that without an education, finally, without an education, he's forced to be doing manual labor, and he saw how hard it was on his mother dies from that milk fever. She's only 9 years old. His sister eventually dies in childbirth along with her baby. He had a hard early start to life. And then when he finally gets to New Salem, he decides he's going to educate himself, and that's when he becomes involved in politics and becomes, he wants to study the lawyer. So if he wasn't on the frontier and he had a different life somewhere else, to think he would still have the inquisitiveness to be wanting to improve his life and be assigned to it, where he's thinking about clouds and how to get clouds.
Yeah, let me come back over here so Zoom can see me. I don't know if Zoom can hear the question, but basically, Lincoln had a pretty rough life early on. I moved around a lot, and he was on the farm, and I had mentioned a couple things from the book. The winter of deep snow and the summer without a year without a summer, messing up my own climate. And basically, this is a hard life for him. And by the time he was an adult, he's like, I'm done with this. I want to be a farmer. This is not the life that I want. If he hadn't had that kind of life, would he have been as interested in the science technology side that he was, and would he have been interested in, interested in, not just kind of extrapolate a bit, in internal improvements and all of these different things that he did that he was talking about. I think those obviously had an effect. So let me phrase it this way. I grew up in a blue collar family myself. Worked on a farm when I was a kid. My father grew up on a farm. And did a lot of hard labor, a lot of blue collar work until I got to college. Went to college, learned I didn't like that life. I like a different life. And went on to, study and get, white collar type jobs. So in a way, I kind of paralleled what Lincoln did. Not that I'm comparing myself to Lincoln, but, I kind of paralleled that. I can see where Lincoln never really stopped thinking like somebody who grew up on the frontier. Fairly poor family, subsistence farms early on, moving around a lot, all these climatic issues they dealt with, a lot of hard labor, and very strong. But these were things that were all physical oriented and had very limited futures associated with them. Most people followed their father and they took over the farm. They took over the back 40, built the house, and that's what they raised their family. Lincoln didn't want to have anything to do with that. Part of that is he just didn't like it, but there were a lot of people who grew up under those conditions and did like it, or at least, even if they didn't like it, they stayed into those situations. Lincoln, even early on, showed that his brain worked a little different. He would always was into intellectual thinking. You know, his father used to complain, it's like, you know, he would walk behind the plow, behind the horses, get to the end of the row, take a break, read a book. Finally turn the horses around and walk back, get to the end, take a break, read a book. You know, and his father was like, it's taking you forever, you know, to do this. So he didn't like that. Lincoln was always thinking that way. He was always thinking, I use the term better his condition several times. Lincoln bettered his condition. And he served as his own poster child for how people could become more than just what they were. And even if I can extrapolate a little bit more, even when you get to the idea of slavery, there's a quote that supposedly Lincoln said, "I used to be a slave," referring to his time, you know, working on the farm, and that his father would farm him out, you know, hire him out to somebody else to do labor, and any money he made had to go to his father, which was the rule. I mean, back then, everybody, all the money belonged to the father until they were 21. But he would think in terms of people with choice, free people can make their lives better. And the way they can do that is to either, you know, labor and start your own company and hire other people to labor for you. And eventually, you know, maybe you could have a life of leisure while everybody's laboring and handing you the money, which is basically how things work these days, how entrepreneurship works. Or you could go and you could do that in farming, or you could do that in through intellectual pursuits. And that was, he took that path. He was going to become a lawyer. He was very interested in it pretty early, long before he was a lawyer. He was illegally practicing law, doing, you know, little things for people that he shouldn't have been doing because he wasn't a lawyer. But on the frontier, the rules are a little less. So he thought that anybody could do that. And that was the big contrast with slavery. I have a whole chapter about the science of slavery. Big difference between free people and slavery. Free people have options to be able to study and become a lawyer, or start your own businesses or move to another area. If you're enslaved, you have no option. You have no way to better your condition. So he did see that contrast, and he did use his hardscrabble life growing up as kind of his own exemplar, to some extent, of how this could be done. Like during war, he gives a speech to a division, drawing a blank on what division it was, what regiment, but he talked to a regiment, and I think it was Pennsylvania regiment. Anyway, he talked to a regiment and he says, you know, any one of you could do what I do. You go up, you could learn how to do things, you could become president someday. So I think, to go back to answering the actual question, I think you're asking, I think he would have done this anyway, unless he was held back, which is what slavery did, it held people back. A lot of people didn't have the intellectual ability, or didn't have the access to books they could borrow, or didn't have the drive. And a lot of this is drive. He self-taught himself. A lot of people could have, they just didn't. Wasn't important to them, so they didn't. So those things really play into how he thought about how people could get better, and that the government could facilitate that process. I think was an important part. And that's an issue, we were talking before, that's an issue that's still important today. You still have a division of thinking. And people who think the government should have an active role. And people who think the government, especially the federal government, should stay out of it. And let you figure things out on your own. The problem with that position, the latter position, is that all you have to do is watch, what happens after a tornado or a hurricane. I'm more than happy to take federal help for those things. So, it's a little fuzzy as how to work. Anyway, long story short, I've gone off on a tangent, but I think he would have continued to push these sorts of things because it was in his nature. It was in his intellect to learn. And to some extent, I can relate to that because I had a pretty, certainly not hard trouble like he did. I was much more privileged than he was. But I did work blue collar jobs, I did labor, and I did go to college, and I did end up doing things like writing books about science and technology that, some of my relatives didn't do. Anyway, it was a very long answer to a question, so if anybody else has any questions, if I've left any time.
I'm asking this because you live in Virginia. And
I'm
I
gonna
think
walk
it's
over
very-
again, because I'm having trouble in this room here.
I went to pick your brain because you are a resident of Fairfax, Virginia, and they had just recently had on the news here that 2 schools in Virginia were returning to their original names and they had Confederate names. And I was wondering, they never mentioned what the names were and how they managed to return.
I don't recall the names either. One was a more recognizable name than the other.
One was Jan, but maybe still back
When Jackson,
maybe.
yeah, I don't remember, the other one was more obscure. Yeah, I guess I think it was 2020, the school system in Virginia decided that they would rename public schools from the name of these Confederate to very innocuous names. They're like Mountain View and Switch Stream, something like that. They were very innocuous, very pleasant sounding names. And then the current school board is a totally different. None of the same people are on the board as was on it then. And they decided that the earlier board somehow didn't have enough public input on the process. And so they voted, as far as I can tell, without any public input. Quite sure their argument works, but anyway, they voted to go back to the old names while they discussed. It costs a few $1 million to change the names. They've already changed the names on the school. Now I don't know if they're actually going to change them back again. Maybe they have the old names still in the closet somewhere. That's an issue. As I said before that a lot of the issues from the Civil War are not really that old. They're still current. A lot of the thinking is still there. In 2020, it's kind of the last straw. I think there had been names changed for schools, the military bases, they've all changed their names now. Quite a few different places have changed their names from Confederate school names. They've taken down statues, Confederate soldiers, Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, others. And they've been doing that for a while now, but it really caught on in 2020, but it had been going on before that. Like after the big massacre down in Charleston, that Nikki Haley, who was governor of South Carolina at the time, took down the Confederate flag from the State House. That had been there at that time, and she took that down because of that. So it's been going on, but those issues, so, you're thinking, where are we now versus then? We're in a lot of the same places. A lot of these issues are pretty fundamental. They're, They just are. Any other questions or anybody online? No?
It's pretty quiet, pretty quiet online today.
Okay,
Well,
no more questions. I'm happy to stop.
we invite everybody to, please, continue the discussion and take a look at some of the books that are available tonight.
And I have this bottle of water.